You ever hear words like democracy and republic thrown around and think, wait, what's the actual difference? Or maybe you've heard military junta on the news and wondered what that even is. Well, today we're going to clear all that up. We're breaking down these big, complicated terms into simple, easy-to-get ideas. So let's dive right in.
Look, it is so easy to get these terms jumbled up, so if you're confused, you are definitely not alone. But stick with me, because by the end of this, you're going to be able to spot the difference between a monarchy and a dictatorship from a mile away. You'll even get the subtle but super important differences between socialism and communism. It's going to be great.
Okay, first up, let's talk about the systems where the power is supposed to be with the people. You know, rule by the many, where we, the citizens, are the ones in charge. Or at least, that's the idea, right?
So let's start with the big one, democracy. At its heart, it literally just means rule by the people. This whole idea goes way, way back to ancient Athens. But today, in modern democracies like the USA or India, it's all about exercising that power through things like free and fair elections. It's how you make sure the government actually answers to the people.
All right, so if that's a democracy, then what's a republic? They seem similar, right? Power comes from the people in both. But here's the crucial twist. Republics are built to protect individual rights, even if the majority of people disagree. It's a really important distinction, and we're about to see exactly why.
Okay, check this out. In a pure democracy, you can end up with what's called a tyranny of the majority. Think about it. If 51% of the people vote to take away the rights of the other 49%, they can. But a republic, well, a republic has safeguards, like a constitution. It's like a rule book that says, nope, there are certain individual rights you just can't vote away, no matter how many people want to.
All right, let's totally switch gears now. We've talked about rule by the many. Now let's look at the complete opposite. Systems where all the power is held by just one person.
And the most classic example of this you can think of is probably a monarchy. You've got a king or a queen, and they hold all the cards. How do they get the job? Well, they inherit it. It's passed down through the bloodline. For centuries, this was justified by this idea of a divine right to rule, like God himself chose their family. This was the setup in places like ancient Egypt and all across medieval Europe.
But, you know, things change. The whole idea of monarchy didn't just disappear. It evolved. Now you have places like the United Kingdom or Japan, which are what we call constitutional monarchies. Here, the king or queen is more of a symbolic figurehead. The real power is with an elected parliament, and everyone has to follow a constitution. It's this really interesting mix of old-school tradition and modern democracy.
Okay, now we're going to get into a much, much darker version of one-person rule, the dictatorship. This is where a single leader has total control, and they almost always take it by force. They stay in power using fear, propaganda, and by crushing anyone who dares to speak out against them. There are absolutely no checks, no balances, just one person's will.
And if you can believe it, it gets even more extreme. That's totalitarianism. A totalitarian government doesn't just want to control the government. It wants to control everything. Every single part of your life, what you read, what you believe, even what you're allowed to think. If you've ever read George Orwell's 1984, that's exactly the kind of chilling society he was warning us about.
So let's nail down this difference, because it's important. A dictator controls the government. A totalitarian regime wants to control your mind. It's all about the scope of that control. That's the key thing that sets them apart.
Okay, so we've done rule by the many and rule by one. So what happens when it's not one person, but a small, powerful group calling all the shots? Well, that brings us to our next category.
This is what we call an oligarchy, which just means rule by the few. In this setup, a little group, maybe they're super rich or they're top military brass, they're the ones in control. The classic historical example is ancient Sparta. But you hear this word oligarchy thrown around a lot today to talk about countries where just a handful of billionaires seem to have all the political power.
Next, we have a theocracy. This one's pretty straightforward. It basically means rule by God. In a theocracy, religious leaders are the government, and the laws of the country come straight from their holy books. You see this in places like Iran or Vatican City, where religious law is the law of the land. Simple as that.
And then you've got the military junta. This happens when the military leaders decide they're in charge now. They seize power, usually in a violent takeover called a coup, and just throw out the elected officials. They'll tear up the Constitution and just start ruling by their own command. And they almost always promise they're just there to restore order, but it usually ends up with a lot of repression.
Okay, for our last section, let's zoom out a bit. We're going to look at some bigger ideas, political theories and structures that aren't governments themselves, but they can shape any of the ones we've already talked about.
First up, a big one, communism. Now let's talk about the theory first. As Karl Marx imagined it, communism is this idea of a society where everything, all property, all resources, is owned by everyone together. People work based on what they can do and get what they need. Sounds utopian, right? Well, the reality was very different. In practice, communist states like the Soviet Union ended up as totalitarian dictatorships, with the government controlling every single thing. And that huge gap between the dream and the reality is one of the biggest stories of the 20th century.
Now, this is where a lot of people get tripped up. Socialism gets confused with communism all the time, but they are not the same thing. In a socialist system, yeah, the government might run some key industries, maybe healthcare or transportation. But, and this is the big but, you can still own your own private business. You can still own private property. Lots of European countries have what you'd call democratic socialism, mixing these ideas.
So if you're going to remember one thing, remember this. The key difference is private property. Communism, at its core, wants to get rid of it completely. Socialism says, hey, we can have private property exist right alongside some government-run services, and it often happens inside a democracy.
Okay, next is federalism. And let's be super clear, this isn't a type of government. It's more like a blueprint for how to organize a government. Think of it this way. In a federal system, you split the power between a big central national government and smaller local ones, like states or provinces. Each level has its own jobs. This is a really popular way to run things in big, diverse countries like the US or Australia, because it helps balance power.
And last but not least, let's talk about anarchy. Now, I know when you hear that word, you probably think of pure chaos, right? But as a political idea, anarchy is actually the belief that people can organize themselves without any rulers or government at all, just through voluntary cooperation. Now, has it ever actually worked on a large national scale? No. But the idea itself is still pretty influential in some circles.
Phew! Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. So to make sure this all sticks, let's wrap it up and pull everything together in a quick little cheat sheet.
This chart right here is your new best friend. It breaks it all down. Super simple. You can see in a second who's in charge, how'd they get the job, and what's the one key thing that defines their role. From the people having the power in a democracy, all the way to one person calling the shots in a dictatorship, this makes it really easy to see those core differences.
You know, the way we humans govern ourselves is never set in stone. It's always changing. And as technology just completely reshapes our world, you have to believe our political systems are going to change right along with it. So that's the big question I want to leave you with. What's next? What on earth will the governments of the future actually look like?